The smell hit him before the sound did. Diesel exhaust and something sharper underneath it, cordite maybe, or the particular chemical stink of freshly disturbed earth, drifting back along the column from somewhere ahead in the darkness. Jochen Peiper stood in the cupola of his command vehicle on the road outside Stavelot, Belgium, on the morning of the 18th of December, 1944, and listened to the silence where a bridge should have been. Not silence exactly. His column was never silent. 45 tons of King Tiger behind him produced the sound that you felt in your back teeth. Half-track engines idled with that particular diesel clatter that had become the background noise of his entire war. Staff officers were talking into radios in clipped, careful voices. All of that was there. What was not there was forward movement. The column had stopped, again. Peiper climbed down and walked toward the front, past vehicles that stretched back into the dark for kilometers, past tank commanders who watched him from their cupolas with expressions carefully arranged into neutrality. He had covered perhaps 200 meters when he saw what he already knew he was going to see. The bridge over the Amblève at Stavelot, or rather, the place where that bridge had been, was a gap in the world. Broken stone, twisted rebar catching the grey pre-dawn light, water moving below, indifferent and cold. Somewhere, upstream or downstream or in a farmhouse cellar or already miles back toward American lines, the men who had done this were gone. They had set their charges, they had waited until the last possible moment, and they had blown the crossing and walked away, or driven away, or run. Peiper did not know their names. He did not know their unit, their commander, their orders. He did not know how many of them there had been, or whether any of them had died doing this, or what they had felt when they pressed the detonator and watched the span drop. What he knew was the cost. In hours, in fuel his vehicles did not have, in the gap between the timetable written in a headquarters somewhere and the reality of this broken stone in front of him. He would learn to know these men, not by name, by method. Part 1. The Doctrine of Denial. The United States Army did not invent the concept of destroying bridges to slow an advancing enemy. Armies have been doing that since the first commander realized that a river crossing was a vulnerability, and that fire was a tool. The Romans used it, the Byzantines used it, Napoleon's engineers blew bridges behind retreating French forces and in front of advancing ones with equal facility. This is not a 20th century innovation, but what the American army developed in the years between the two world wars, and refined with brutal speed once the second one started, was something more specific and more systematic than simple denial. It was a doctrine of delay. And the distinction matters enormously. Destroying a bridge to deny it to an enemy is reactive. You blow it when you're leaving, when the enemy is close, when you have no choice. The doctrine of delay is different. It is proactive. It asks, how much time can we buy? How many crossings can we deny? How do we force an armoured column off its timetable and onto ours? It treats every bridge, every culvert, every ford as a potential decision point. And it assigns specific men, combat engineers, the responsibility of making those decisions under fire. The theoretical foundation for this thinking came from a generation of American military engineers who had studied the Great War and drawn specific conclusions. The war of 1914 to 1918 had demonstrated, at catastrophic cost, that static defense was a killing ground. The war of 1939 to 1942 had demonstrated, at equally catastrophic cost, that mobile armoured warfare could bypass, encircle, and destroy static defenders before they understood what was happening. The American doctrine that emerged from these two lessons was built around one central idea. You cannot stop an armoured column with infantry alone. But you can slow it. You can force it to spend time it does not have. You can make it bleed fuel and hours and momentum on problems that should not exist. The engineers were the instrument of this philosophy. The combat engineer's role in the American Army of World War II was not glamorous. Engineers built things, bridges, roads, airstrips, fortifications. But they also destroyed things. They were trained in demolitions, in the placement of charges, in the calculation of how much explosive was required to drop a specific type of bridge span into a specific type of river. They carried this knowledge the way an infantryman carries his rifle, as the basic tool of the trade. The field manual that governed their demolitions work, FM 5-15, Engineer Field Manual, Roads, was a document of extraordinary practical specificity. It covered the weight of charges required for timber bridges, steel bridges, masonry bridges, reinforced concrete. It covered the placement of charges to achieve maximum structural failure with minimum explosive material. It covered the timing of detonation, the use of electrical versus non-electrical firing systems, the construction of hasty demolitions when time was short and proper placement was impossible. This was not abstract theory. This was a curriculum designed to produce soldiers who could, under fire, in the dark, with enemy armor audible in the distance, destroy a bridge effectively enough that a 60-ton tank could not cross it. And in December of 1944, those soldiers were waiting in the Ardennes. The German plan for the Ardennes offensive, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, was built on a timetable so tight that it bordered on fantasy. Field Marshal Walter Model knew it, General Hasso von Manteuffel knew it. Even Hitler, in his more lucid moments, must have understood that the margin between success and failure was measured not in days, but in hours. The entire strategic logic of the offensive depended on reaching the Meuse River within 2 to 3 days of the initial breakthrough, 4 days at the absolute outside. After that, Allied air power would return, weather permitting, Allied reserves would arrive, and the window would close. Peiper's Kampfgruppe was the tip of that spear. He had been selected personally, briefed personally, and given a route that had been planned at the highest levels of German command. The route ran west through the Ardennes, through a series of river valleys, across a series of bridges. The planners had assumed those bridges would be intact. They had to assume that. If the bridges were blown, the timetable was dead. And if the timetable was dead, the offensive was dead. Hold that thought. Now meet the men who were going to blow those bridges. The American soldiers responsible for demolitions along Peiper's projected route were drawn primarily from the combat engineer battalions attached to the units defending that sector. One of the most consequential of these was the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion, a unit that had been in Europe since the Normandy campaign and had accumulated the kind of practical demolitions experience that no field manual can fully replicate. Meet Private First Class Harold Lindsay, 20 years old, from Morgantown, West Virginia, where his father worked in the coal industry. Lindsay had enlisted in 1942, completed basic training at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, the Army's primary engineer training installation, and had been assigned to the 291st in the spring of 1944. He was not an officer. He was not a planner. He was the man who carried the wire, who helped place the charges, who waited for the order, and then did what he had been trained to do. There were hundreds of men like Harold Lindsay in the Ardennes in December of 1944. Most of their names are not in the history books. Their actions are. The morning of December 16, 1944, the German offensive opened with a barrage of 2,000 artillery pieces along a front of approximately 140 kilometers. The American lines in the Ardennes were thin. This was considered a quiet sector, a place to rest divisions that had been ground down in harder fighting elsewhere. The units holding the line were a mixture of exhausted veterans and green replacements who had never been under fire. The initial German assault tore through the American front in multiple places. Within hours, the situation was deteriorating so rapidly that unit commanders were making decisions without clear information, without reliable communications, and without any certainty about where the German main effort was actually directed. It was in this chaos, this genuine, unscripted, terrifying chaos, that the doctrine of delay was tested. And it held. Not because the commanders were brilliant, though some were. Not because the soldiers were superhuman, though some of what they did approached that category. It held because the training was specific enough, the doctrine was clear enough, and the individual soldiers trusted enough in their own judgment to act when they had to act. The bridges were the key. There were dozens of them, Small ones, large ones, timber ones, concrete ones, stone ones. Each one represented a potential crossing point for Peiper's armour. Each one, if left intact, could shave hours off his timetable. Each one, if destroyed, could add hours he did not have. The engineers knew this. Their orders were explicit. Deny the crossings. If you cannot hold the bridge, blow it. Ostanovis I podumaj o betom. Stop and think about that. These were young men, many of them teenagers, many of them in the first real combat of their lives, being told to stand near a bridge with enemy armour approaching and wait. Wait until the last possible moment to ensure maximum denial, then blow it and run. The margin for error was measured in minutes, sometimes less. Part 2. The Column and the Clock. Kampfgruppe Peiper was by any objective measure one of the most powerful armoured formations the German army fielded in the entire Western campaign. At full strength, which it was not, but close enough, it comprised approximately 800 vehicles, including approximately 72 Panzer IV and Panzer V Panther tanks, approximately 30 King Tiger tanks from the heavy tank battalion attached to the formation, and a substantial complement of half-tracks, self-propelled guns, armoured cars, and supporting vehicles. The King Tiger, Königstiger, officially the Tiger II, deserves a moment of attention here because it is directly relevant to what happened at the bridges. The Tiger II weighed 68 tons. 68 tons. Its armour at the front hull was 150 mm thick at an angle. Its gun, the 88mm KWK-43, could penetrate virtually any Allied tank at combat ranges. It was, in purely mechanical terms, the most formidable tank the Germans deployed in the West. It was also a nightmare to move. A 68-ton vehicle requires a bridge rated to carry 68 tons, plus the dynamic load of a moving vehicle, which can be significantly higher than the static load. Most of the bridges in the Ardennes were not rated for that. Most of them had never needed to be. This was farming country, logging country, small-town Belgian countryside. The bridges were built for trucks, for farm equipment, for the occasional heavy vehicle, not for 68-ton steel monsters. This was not a secret. The German planners knew it. Peiper knew it. The route assigned to Kampfgruppe Peiper had been selected in part because it was supposed to have bridges capable of handling the weight. Supposed to. Here is the detail that the history books often gloss over. Peiper had, before the offensive began, expressed serious reservations about his assigned route. He had studied the maps, studied the bridge data, and concluded that the route was, his word, as recorded in post-war interrogations, impractical for heavy armour. He had requested a different route. He was refused. The route was fixed. He set out anyway because that was what he was ordered to do, and because Jochen Peiper was not a man who disobeyed orders. Whatever else can be said about him, and a great deal can and must be said about him, and we will say it, he was a professional soldier who executed his mission. The column began moving on the night of December 16, 1944. Almost immediately, it ran into problems. The first problem was not the Americans. The first problem was the roads. The Ardennes road network in that sector was inadequate for the volume of traffic the German offensive was generating. Peiper's route ran through narrow valleys, along roads that were barely wide enough for a single vehicle, past bottlenecks where the terrain forced everything through a single point. The column, 25 kilometers long, could not move at highway speed. It moved at the speed of its slowest element, which was often not much faster than a walking pace. The second problem arrived almost simultaneously, the fuel situation. Peiper's column was supposed to capture American fuel dumps along its route of advance. This was not a contingency plan, this was the plan. The German logistics system was so strained by late 1944 that Kampfgruppe Peiper was sent into the Ardennes without sufficient fuel to complete its mission independently. It needed to find and capture American supplies. This was a gamble that required everything to go right. Nothing went right. Meet First Lieutenant Virgil T. Larry Jr., 24 years old, from Munfordville, Kentucky. He was a battery commander in the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. On December 17, 1944, his battery was moving along the road through Bognes, a small crossroads south of Malmedy, Belgium, when it encountered Peiper's advance guard. What happened at Bognes Crossroads on December 17th became one of the most documented atrocities of the Western Front. Approximately 140 American prisoners of war, most of them from Larry's battery, were assembled in a field and shot. 84 of them died. Larry survived by feigning death. He crawled away through the snow and eventually reached American lines. Stop and think about that number. 84 men, murdered in a field, not in combat, after capture. Larry's testimony, given in detail and under oath at the Malmedy massacre trial in Dachau in 1946, is one of the primary documentary records of what happened. He described the shooting, the screaming, the men falling. He described lying still in the snow while German soldiers walked among the bodies, firing coup de grace shots into anyone who appeared to be alive. He described the cold, not just the weather, but the cold of understanding that he was going to die in a Belgian field, far from Kentucky, for no reason that made any military sense. Peiper was held responsible for this atrocity. The legal and historical debate about his precise degree of personal culpability has continued for decades. What is not in dispute is that his command committed the massacre, that it was not an isolated incident in the history of his unit, and that the pattern of behavior was consistent with a command culture that had been forged on the Eastern Front, where the rules of war were treated as obstacles rather than obligations. This matters for our investigation because it shapes how we understand Peiper's frustration with the blown bridges. He was not simply a frustrated professional soldier encountering a skilled opponent. He was a man whose command had already committed war crimes before the bridges became the central problem. The professional admiration encoded in verdammte Pioniere existed alongside a capacity for murder that should not be forgotten or softened. Both things are true. That is the complexity this investigation requires. Now, back to the bridges. The first major bridge denial that shaped Peiper's advance came at Stavelot on the Amblev River. The bridge at Stavelot was a stone arch bridge, solid, old, capable of bearing substantial weight. It was, from Peiper's perspective, exactly what he needed, and on the night of December 17th, it was intact. The American defenders at Stavelot were thin. A small detachment of the 329th Infantry Regiment, reinforced by elements of the 526th Armoured Infantry Battalion, was holding the town. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. When Peiper's advance guard hit Stavelot in the early hours of December 18th, the Americans fell back, but they did not blow the bridge. Not yet. This is one of the more painful episodes in the American defense of the Ardennes, and it deserves honest examination. The bridge at Stavelot was prepared for demolition. The charges were in place. The decision to blow it required an order, and the officer with the authority to give that order made the calculation, under fire, in the dark, with incomplete information, that the bridge was still needed for American vehicles to withdraw. He was wrong, or rather the situation changed faster than the calculation could keep up with. Peiper's armour crossed the Stavelot Bridge in the early hours of December 18th. That single detail deserves close attention. The crossing at Stavelot gave Peiper approximately 12 hours of additional momentum. 12 hours. Against a timetable that was already fraying, 12 hours was significant. It was not decisive. Too many other problems had already accumulated, but it was real. And then the engineers caught up. After Stavelot, the American demolitions effort became more consistent, more aggressive, and more effective. The officers and NCOs responsible for bridge demolitions along Peiper's projected route had now seen what the column was and understood what was at stake. The hesitation that had cost the Stavelot Bridge did not repeat itself in the same way. The bridge at Trois Ponts, the name means simply 3 bridges, which tells you something about the geography, was the next critical crossing point. Trois Ponts sat at the confluence of the Amblev and Salm rivers, 3 bridges in close proximity, any one of which could allow Peiper to continue his advance toward the Meuse. The defenders were a small detachment of the 51st Combat Engineer Battalion, fewer than 100 men. against an armoured column of thousands. They blew all 3 bridges. Peiper arrived at Trois Ponts on the afternoon of December 18th to find the crossings gone. His options narrowed immediately and dramatically. He was forced north onto a secondary road that ran along the Amblève Valley towards Stoumont and L'Église. This diversion cost him time, fuel, and momentum. It also took him away from his primary route and into terrain that was increasingly unfavourable for armour. The decision made by those engineers at Trois Ponts, fewer than 100 men, with a King Tiger column bearing down on them, may be the single most consequential tactical decision of the entire Battle of the Bulge. Not the largest, not the most dramatic, the most consequential, because it forced Peiper's column away from the route that gave it any chance of reaching the Meuse. Peiper knew it too. His post-war accounts, given in interrogations and interviews, consistently returned to Trois Ponts as the moment when his mission became impossible. He understood it in real time. He arrived at the blown bridges and understood what had been taken from him. Verdammter Pionier. Part 3. The Men with the Wire. To understand what those engineers actually did, not in the abstract, not as a tactical decision, but as a physical act performed by specific human beings in specific conditions, you need to spend a moment with the mechanics of bridge demolition under fire. A standard preparation for the demolition of a masonry or concrete bridge in 1944 involved several steps, none of which were simple and all of which took time. First, the charges had to be placed. This meant attaching explosive material, typically TNT blocks, demolition charges, or captured German explosives, when American supplies were short, to the structural members of the bridge most critical to its integrity. For an arch bridge, this was the haunches of the arch. For a beam bridge, the primary girders. For a timber bridge, the main supports. The placement had to be precise enough to ensure complete structural failure, not just damage. Then, the firing system had to be installed. In most cases, this meant electrical detonators connected by wire to a firing device, a blasting machine, a small hand-cranked generator that produced the electrical impulse to trigger the detonators. The wire had to be run from the charges to a position far enough from the bridge to protect the operator from the blast. In practice, this meant running wire across open ground, sometimes under fire, to a position that was exposed and dangerous. Then, someone had to wait. This is the part that does not translate easily into historical narrative: the waiting. The standing at the firing device, watching the road, listening for the sound of engines, knowing that the column was coming and that the order to fire had not yet been given because the order was to wait as long as possible, to deny the crossing to the enemy while allowing the maximum number of friendly vehicles to use it. The order to blow came, when it came properly, from the officer responsible for the bridge. That officer was making a calculation under conditions that would have broken most people. How close is the enemy? How many of our own vehicles still need to cross? Is there still time to run after firing? Is the wire intact? Is the blasting machine functional? Did the charges shift during the night? Now consider the additional variable, the King Tiger. A 68-ton tank does not sound like anything else. When the ground starts to shake and the engine noise resolves into something specific and enormous, the soldiers at the firing device knew what was coming. They knew it could not be stopped by anything they were personally carrying. The only weapon they had was the bridge itself. Meet Technical Sergeant Charles Hensel, 26 years old, from Flemington, New Jersey, where his family ran a hardware store. Hensel was a demolition specialist with the 51st Combat Engineer Battalion, the same unit that destroyed the bridges at Trois Ponts. He had been in the army since 1942, had completed the Advanced Engineer course at Fort Belvoir, and had participated in demolitions operations in Normandy and during the drive through France. Hensel's account of the Trois Ponts demolitions, given in an after-action report filed with the Battalion S3 on December 21, 1944, is one of the most precise primary source documents of the Ardennes campaign. It is not dramatic, it reads like an engineer's report, which is what it is. It describes the charges used, the placement, the firing sequence, the time between the first sound of approaching German vehicles and the detonation. That time was approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes from the first audible indication that Peiper's column was approaching to the moment the charges fired and the bridge dropped into the Amblev. Think about what 4 minutes means in that context. 4 minutes is not a long time when you are waiting at a firing device with a King Tiger column somewhere in the dark beyond the tree line. It is an eternity when you are trying to decide whether to fire now or wait another 60 seconds because there might be American vehicles still trying to reach the crossing. Hensel fired. The bridge went down. The column stopped. The technical details of the demolitions at Trois Ponts, reconstructed from Hensel's report and from post-war engineering surveys of the damage, are worth examining briefly. The main bridge over the Salm River, a reinforced concrete structure approximately 18 meters in span, was dropped by charges placed at both abutments and at the crown of the main span. The explosive weight used was approximately 120 pounds of TNT equivalent. The bridge did not just crack, it collapsed. The central span dropped into the river, leaving a gap that no vehicle in Peiper's column could cross without bridging equipment that was not available. The smaller bridge over the Amblev, a timber structure, was destroyed with approximately 60 pounds of explosive. It burned as well as collapsed. Timber bridges have that advantage from a denial perspective. The third crossing, a railway bridge, was blown by a separate team using demolition charges pre-positioned by the battalion engineers days before the offensive began. 3 bridges, 100 men, 4 minutes. That is the arithmetic of what stopped Kampfgruppe Peiper at Trois Ponts. But the story does not end there, because Peiper did not stop. He diverted north, as noted, and pushed towards Stoumont and La Glaise. And as he moved north, the engineers moved with him. Not the same men, but the same doctrine, the same training, the same willingness to stand at a firing device and wait until the last possible moment. The bridge at Lienne Creek, northeast of Trois Ponts, was the next critical crossing. Peiper's diversion had brought him onto a road that crossed the Lienne at a point where the creek was not fordable for heavy armour. The bridge was small, a timber and concrete structure, not particularly impressive, but it was the only crossing in that sector capable of bearing his tanks. The detachment responsible for that bridge was even smaller than the one at Trois Ponts. Approximately a dozen men from the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion. They had no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping a King Tiger. They had wire, blasting caps, TNT, and a firing machine. Peiper's advance guard reached the Lienne Creek Bridge on the afternoon of December 18th. The American detachment blew it as the German vehicles were approaching the crossing. There is a detail in the after-action report from the 291st that does not appear in most accounts of this episode. The detachment commander, a staff sergeant whose name appears in the report but who has not been publicly identified in subsequent histories, waited until the lead German vehicle was approximately 100 meters from the bridge before firing. 100 meters. For a tank moving at even a moderate speed, 100 meters is seconds. He waited that long because there were still American vehicles in the area that might need the crossing. He fired when he had to fire. The bridge went down. Peiper's column stopped again. This is the pattern that Peiper encountered over and over across the Ardennes. Not a single catastrophic defeat. Not a dramatic battle. A series of small denials, each one precise, each one costing him something he could not afford to lose. Time. By the evening of December 18th, Kampfgruppe Peiper had been stopped at Trois Ponts, diverted north, stopped again at Lienne Creek, and forced into the narrow valley around La Glaise and Stoumont. His fuel was critically low. His timetable was dead. The Meuse River, the objective that was supposed to have been reached in 2 days, was still more than 40 kilometers away. He would never get closer than that. And here is the forensic detail that matters most. Peiper's column was not stopped by American tanks. It was not stopped by American infantry, though the infantry fought with tremendous courage in those days. It was not stopped by American artillery, though the artillery contributed. It was stopped primarily by engineers with explosives and the doctrine and training and nerve to use them at the right moment. The mid-roll note belongs here, between the mechanics and the verdict. The men described in this investigation, Harold Lindsay, Virgil Larry, Charles Hensel, the unnamed staff sergeant at Lienne Creek, were ordinary Americans placed in extraordinary circumstances. Larry survived to testify. Hensel filed his report and went back to work. Lindsay's fate after the Ardennes is not recorded in the sources available for this investigation. The staff sergeant at the Lienne Creek Bridge appears in one document and nowhere else. They were not famous, they were not decorated with the medals their actions warranted, in most cases. They did their jobs. If this investigation gives you a clearer picture of what those jobs actually required, not the sanitized version, not the summary and the regimental history, but the thing itself. Standing in the dark with a firing machine while the ground shakes, then press the like button. It keeps this history visible a little longer. That matters. Part 4. The forensic verdict. The forensic verdict of this investigation comes down to this. Kampfgruppe Peiper failed in its mission not because of a single decisive defeat, but because of the cumulative effect of a systematic denial campaign executed by American combat engineers who had been trained for exactly this scenario, and who, in the most critical moments, performed with a precision and nerve that their training demanded and their circumstances required. The blown bridges did not stop Peiper alone. Nothing stopped him alone. The Battle of the Bulge was a complex, multi-layered engagement involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides, fought across a front of approximately 140 kilometers over approximately 6 weeks. But within the specific story of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the units that came closest to breaking through, the units that had the best chance of reaching the Meuse and creating the conditions for a German strategic success, the bridges were decisive. Let's be precise about this. Peiper needed to reach the Meuse by approximately December 19th. His route required intact bridges at multiple crossing points. He received intact bridges at some of those points, Stavelot being the most significant, and was denied them at others, with Troipon being the most consequential single denial. The net effect of these denials was to force him north, into terrain that was unsuitable for armour, away from his primary route, and onto a timetable that had already slipped beyond recovery. By December 23rd, Kampfgruppe Peiper was surrounded at L'Église. Peiper had approximately 800 men still capable of fighting, a dwindling number of operational tanks, and virtually no fuel. He requested permission to break out. He was eventually granted it. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, he led approximately 800 men on foot through the Ardennes, abandoning his vehicles, his wounded, and his equipment, and reached German lines. He left behind approximately 135 vehicles, including dozens of tanks, including 6 King Tigers. He left behind the wreckage of what had been the most powerful armoured spearhead on the Western Front. The question this investigation has been building toward is a specific one. Did Peiper understand what had beaten him? And the answer, drawn from his post-war statements, his interrogation records, and the historical account of his conduct during the Ardennes campaign, is yes. He understood it clearly. Peiper was interrogated extensively after his capture at the end of the war. His interrogators were American officers, some of them from units that had fought against him in the Ardennes. The interrogation records, declassified and available through the National Archives, contain his assessments of the American defense with a frankness that is striking. He was not a man given to false modesty, but he was precise about what had stopped him. He returned consistently to 3 factors: the blown bridges, the defense of the Elsenborn Ridge by the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions, which prevented the German forces to his north from widening the corridor and securing his flanks, and the fuel situation. Of these 3, he was most consistent in his assessment of the bridges as the factor over which he had the least control and which had the most immediate operational effect. The phrase "verdammter Pionier" appears in multiple post-war accounts. It appears in the recollections of German officers who served under Peiper and who described his reaction to the blown bridges at Troipon. It appears, in slightly varying forms, in accounts written by American historians who interviewed surviving members of the Kampfgruppe in the 1950s and 1960s. The precise moment of utterance cannot be pinned to a single location or a single bridge. It may have been said more than once, which is entirely plausible given that the experience was repeated across multiple crossings. But the sentiment is consistent and documented. Peiper regarded the American engineers as the most effective component of the American defense in his sector. Not the tank destroyers, not the artillery, Not the infantry, though he respected the infantry at specific points. The engineers, the men who had blown the bridges. This professional respect is historically significant, and it needs to be understood in its full complexity. Peiper's admiration for the American engineers was genuine. It was also the admiration of a man who had, days earlier, overseen the murder of 84 American prisoners. The professional respect and the atrocity are not separate things. They are part of the same person, the same command, the same formation. Jochen Peiper was convicted of war crimes at the Malmedy massacre trial in 1946 and sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1956. He moved to France, to a small village called Traves in the Haute-Saône department, where he lived quietly under the name Henri Leclerc for several years. He was identified by French journalists and communist activists in the mid-1970s. On the night of July 13th to 14th, 1976, Bastille Day, his house was firebombed. His body was found in the ruins. He was 60 years old. The men who blew the bridges at Trois Ponts outlived him, those who survived the war. The 51st Combat Engineer Battalion, which executed the most consequential of the demolitions, was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions in the Ardennes. The citation is specific about the bridge demolitions and their operational effect. It is, in the dry language of military decorations, an acknowledgement of exactly what this investigation has been documenting, that a small number of men with explosives and training and nerve changed the course of the battle. The 291st Combat Engineer Battalion received similar recognition. The individual engineers, the Hensels, the Lindsays, the unnamed staff sergeants at unnamed crossings received, in most cases, the standard campaign medals. The army did not have a specific decoration for blew a bridge while a king tiger was 100 meters away. Perhaps it should have. Now consider the broader implications of what the American engineers demonstrated in the Ardennes. The doctrine of delay, the systematic use of demolitions to deny crossing points and force an attacker onto an unfavorable timetable, required three things to function. Adequate preparation time, which the engineers had in most cases because the Ardennes was considered a quiet sector. Clear orders, which the doctrine provided. And individual soldiers willing to execute those orders under conditions that were genuinely terrifying. The third element is the one that cannot be trained into a soldier. It can be prepared for. It can be cultivated. The training at Fort Belvoir, the field exercises, the demolitions courses, all of these created the technical foundation. But the willingness to stand at a firing device while a King Tiger column approaches is not a technical skill. It is something else. The American Army of World War II produced soldiers capable of that kind of action in sufficient numbers to make the doctrine work. This was not inevitable. It was not guaranteed. It was the result of a specific institutional culture, a specific training philosophy, and a specific relationship between officers and enlisted men that allowed soldiers to trust their own judgment when the situation demanded it. Peiper's assessment of the engineers, Verdammte Pioniere, was, in this sense, an assessment of that culture as much as of the individual acts. He was acknowledging that the Americans had produced soldiers who could be trusted to act correctly in the most difficult circumstances. For a German officer whose own command culture had, by 1944, been severely distorted by Hitler's interference, political ideology, and the brutalizing effects of the Eastern Front, this may have been a more painful acknowledgement than it appeared. The German army's own combat engineers, Pioniere, were excellent. They were, in many respects, better trained and more experienced than their American counterparts at the individual technical level. But in the Ardennes, in December of 1944, the German Pioniere were not in a position to do what the American engineers did. They were advancing, not defending. The doctrine of delay belongs to the defender, and the defender, in the Ardennes in December of 1944, was American. There is one more element of this story that belongs in the verdict, and it concerns the planning failure on the German side. The German planners who selected Peiper's route knew, or should have known, that the route's viability depended on intact bridges. They knew that American combat engineers were trained in demolitions. They knew that the American doctrine called for bridge denial in the face of an armored advance. They planned around this risk by assuming that the speed and surprise of the offensive would not allow the Americans time to execute demolitions. They were wrong. Not catastrophically wrong at every point. Stavelot was a genuine failure of American demolitions execution, but wrong enough, at enough critical points, that the assumption underlying the entire route plan was invalidated within the first 24 hours of the offensive. This is a planning failure of the first order, and it belongs to the German High Command, not to Peiper. He had, as noted, expressed reservations about the route before the offensive began. He was overruled. When the bridges proved to be the problem he had anticipated, he had no alternative route, no bridging equipment adequate for his heaviest vehicles, and no time to improvise. The timetable that the German offensive required was incompatible with the reality of the terrain and the capability of the American engineers. These two facts were in direct contradiction from the moment the plan was finalized. The American engineers did not create that contradiction, they exploited it precisely and effectively in the minutes and hours when it mattered. Verdammte Pioniere. Peiper said it standing beside a river in Belgium, looking at a gap where a bridge had been. He was exhausted, he was behind schedule, and he was beginning to understand that he was not going to reach the Meuse. He said it about men whose names he did not know, whose faces he had not seen, who had done their work and run before his column arrived. He was right to say it. He was right in the way that professionals are right when they acknowledge that someone else did their job better than they expected. The engineers had been given a task: deny the crossings, buy the time, and they had executed it with a precision and nerve that changed the outcome of a battle and, arguably, shortened the war in the West by months. That is not a small thing. That is the thing itself. The men who carried the wire and ran the detonator cable and waited in the cold for the order that would tell them to fire and run, they did not get famous. Harold Lindsay went home to West Virginia, if he survived, and probably did not talk much about it because men of that generation often didn't. Charles Hensel went back to Flemington, New Jersey, and presumably went back to the hardware store. The staff sergeant at Leanne Creek exists in one after-action report and nowhere else that this investigation could find. Peiper is in the history books, he is in the films, his name is known by anyone who has spent serious time with the history of the Ardennes. The engineers are not famous. Their bridges are gone, rebuilt decades ago, carrying farm trucks and tourist buses through the Belgian countryside. The Amblève still runs through Trois Ponts. The Sarm still runs through it too. The confluence looks peaceful now, which is what confluences look like when they are not being contested. But in December of 1944, that confluence was where Kampfgruppe Peiper ran out of options, and the men who made that happen were carrying wire and blasting caps and a field manual that told them exactly where to place the charges and exactly how much explosive was required. They were damned engineers. Peiper meant it as a curse. History reads it as a compliment. If this investigation gave you something, a clearer picture of what those men actually did, in the dark, in the cold, with the ground shaking, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember this: the most consequential act in a battle is not always the most visible one. Sometimes it is a man with a firing machine and 4 minutes, and the nerve to wait 3 of them. December 1944. The Amblève River Valley, Belgium. Jochen Peiper is standing beside his command vehicle on a road that has become a dead end. The bridge is out, the crossing is gone, the timetable is dead. Somewhere behind him, in the dark, an American engineer is running.